Hi, I'm really excited to introduce our next guest. He is a multi-talented individual from the Long Island of New Zealand, down there in the south part of the world. He has been a CEO of an organization, a Murdoch-owned news organization. He has a Ph.D. Where he studied the self. He's a successful real estate investor, and he runs an organizational psychology consultancy. So his background is perfect for us to talk about self-leadership and success. Please welcome not only a man of incredible background, but also a very good friend of mine, Dr. Paul Englert. Hi, Paul.
G'day. Hi, Andrew. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. So we're talking about self-leadership and success. So let's start with the end in mind. For you, as a person who has a lot of experience, what does success look like for you?
I think success is multi-domained, and I think that's a key thing. I think a lot of people who fail to get the success formula correct is they don't recognize that life is multi-domain. And we have...
What do you mean by multi-domain? Expand on that for me.
I mean that we have multiple domains in which we operate. So we have our family domain, we have our health domain, we have our career domain, we have our community domain, we have our family domain. I may have already said that, but all of these domains are important. And when I think of success, I think of somebody who has all of those domains operating well. And I think that definition of success stops you putting somebody on a pedestal who might be strong in one particular area, but the rest of their life is the casualty of the path that they've taken to get there.
Thanks. And you and I have both coached senior leaders, CEOs in organizations. And so we've both seen people that outwardly look very successful, but when they open up, sometimes we find that they don't have that multi-domain success. Obviously, without naming names, do you have anything come to mind in terms of somebody who on the outside looks successful, but maybe some of the wheels were falling off?
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens a lot. I think that unless you're cognizant of all of the different domains, I think it's really easy to get trapped in focusing in one particular area. So, if we take career as a particular space, and a lot of the people that I coach are in senior levels in organizations, and they've given up a lot to get there. And then at some point they start to realize that the price has been too much, and that there has been a cost across many domains. I also I work with a lot of people who would be considered, say, tier 3, who are thinking of that next move. Mm-hmm. And I'm always impressed when they start to sit back and say, actually, if I did take that position, I don't know whether I'd be able to keep the other domains of my life in order. And the decision is not so much a capability issue of whether they could move up to that area. It's not even a willingness issue, in that they would be willing to do that, but that they need to recognize, or they recognize up front, the personal cost. And that becomes part of the discussion, that becomes part of the negotiation that they have with their senior team.
Okay. Well, that segues beautifully into the self-leadership model, which you're familiar with, which really starts its cybernetic loop with self-awareness, right? And with somebody who's researched self, psychometrics, the measurement of self or personality, what role do you think self-awareness plays in success?
I think self-awareness is hugely important. And it's, again, it's multifaceted, because with self-awareness, self-acceptance is a big part of that. Learning to accept oneself, learning to recognize your human frailties, your own limitations, the things that you're strong in, the things that you have to be cognizant of, that you need to have systems around. That's hugely important for self-leadership and for success. We all have a different makeup. We are individuals to the core.
Okay.
And understanding your individuality is important.
Yeah, I think understanding your individuality, but you realize what you're saying, around the success sphere. Of course, there's a lot talked about, about being strong and believing, and if you work hard enough, you can be. And yet you're saying something that is countercultural to an extent, which is, successful people actually recognize their own frailties.
Absolutely. I think we've all had, everyone who's got or been successful or is successful, I was going to say has achieved a level of success, they've had mentors along the way. And I certainly had a good mentor who was influential in the role that I had with respect to the partly owned news company. And he taught me a lot in terms of identifying where my personal derailers could be, where the things that I needed to be mindful of, and to put systems in place to ensure that that I acknowledged those, but also that they were taken care of. Okay. And absolutely, self-awareness is a huge part of that whole equation.
But then that's the self-awareness moving into the self-regulation when you talk about systems.
Yeah.
But again, I think it's refreshing for us to talk about this because, a lot of motivational speakers, I shared the stage with a lot of motivational speakers, just believe and you can achieve all this sort of, hyperbolic rhetoric. So you had a mentor that shared with you where you could go off the rails, your derailers. All right. Are you prepared to share, just to make people watching this feel okay about their own derailers? What is it that takes you off the rails?
For sure. And I think it's being able to share it is important because it loses a lot of its power if you share it. It becomes something that you're not afraid of. I think at times I can be very big picture. Yeah. And so I need people around me who can deal with the detail. The detail is something that often will slip. I can get a little bit cerebral pretty quickly. And I need to make sure that I'm not losing people along the way. I can have a logic in my mind, but I may have missed some of the steps. And so I need to do that. I'm also naturally more introverted than extroverted. And so in roles where I've had to get out there, I've had to prepare myself. As one of the things that I've learned actually from yourself is that idea of making yourself a vessel, and making yourself prepared. Mm-hmm. So being prepared for those types of situations, getting not into character, but getting into a frame, and being ready to, if I do have to socialize, I know that it's going to be something that I have to, it's going to be more of a stretch for me. Okay,
great. So losing it in the big picture, sometimes missing the steps for the people that are following you. So you mentioned that, to be successful, recognizing, accepting that we're not perfect, and then having systems in place, the self-regulation. So for you, being an introvert, you need to, the vessel of confidence, I call it, the fact that confidence is physiological and then you can put the content in secondary and then you're ready to present. All right. So do you have any other strategies or systems that you self-regulate with, put yourself in the best state that enabled you to be successful?
Yeah, I'm very taken with the idea of distributed cognition, or the idea of outsourcing my brain. So not relying on my brain to remember where I have to be, using a diary and diarizing things well in advance. This is sort of that whole David Allen getting things done type methodology. I think there's a lot behind that, and the more that I've dug into that, it's very aligned to the whole organized mind type thinking. And I think that type of strategy, especially if you really want to aim for big goals, I think it's very important, because it's too easy if you allow things to happen by chance to find yourself wasting time or doing activities that are not in line with where you're ultimately wanting to go.
And just as an aside, reminded me today, I was just walking past my wife and she said to me, "I know you've got a lot on your mind, but just let me tell you this." And I'm like, "No, I've got a lot on my mind. Email it to me."
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually a really good point you make, because I think I know for myself, email is great because I can control it. If we just talk about mediums in which people communicate, living in Asia, people use WhatsApp a lot, and I find it a really difficult medium I've never mastered it. I will get WhatsApp messages and just forget about them because I use my email as my sort of go-to.
Yeah.
And because I can control it and I can control my time. And I think you have to, one thing I've found certainly as a consultant is to train my clients to not expect immediate results as well as immediate turnaround, to realize that I actually partition my time to do those sorts of things. And that's what I train when I'm doing coaching as well, as getting people to take control of their time, because it's such an important resource.
Okay. I absolutely know what you mean, but I just want to reframe this, because I actually don't think we control time. I think we control ourselves in time, right? Because time happens, right? So, it's just a turn of phrase, but we don't actually control time. We choose to be in the appropriate state at the appropriate time, right? So I'm assuming you block out chunks of your time to do certain things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And blocking them out well in advance. So on a Sunday night, I will look at my week and I will block out those times. And I try to put them in sort of 15-minute intervals so that I'm not blocking out big hours, but looking at an activity and saying, well, that's going to take me 45 minutes. I'm a big believer in utilizing the science. And so the science sort of indicates that we can do a task for 52 minutes and then a 17-minute break. That's pretty much the ideal. That model has worked pretty well for me. I tend to work for sort of 45 minutes, then take a 15-minute break. And I'm pretty militant in keeping to those sort of time frames.
All right. So then in terms of your balance, then you've got to manage relationships around that as well, right?
Absolutely. And so you block out that time as well. And it doesn't sound particularly romantic, but it enables, certainly my wife is equally as busy. And so it enables us to look at our schedules and make sure that we're making quality time for each other, time which is completely free, where we can just be together and that there's nothing scheduled, but at least it's out of her diary, it's out of my diary, and we know we're going to be together then.
Okay, awesome. So you've had some self-awareness, you recognize a bit about yourself, you've regulated, you've got some strategies particularly for you. What was that term? You distributed cognition, did you call it?
Yeah, just basically having cognition outside of here and distributing that cognition to somewhere else.
Expanding your brain. So then it brings around to the learning loop, right? So with this, you had a mentor gave you some instruction or maybe some feedback. You're giving yourself some feedback from the calendar around your efficiency and effectiveness. What self-learning strategies do you have? Because I know you're constantly educating yourself as well as educating others. What do you use to be successful around continuous learning?
It's a really interesting point, and I think it's a really pertinent point. A really good, strong part of your model, I think, is the learning component, because it's not talked about enough. I think people do talk a little bit about self-regulation. I think they do talk about self-awareness, but the role of learning, I think, is underplayed. I'm fortunate that I have an academic career at the same time. So I define myself as a pracademic and a practicing academic. And as an academic, I'm always humbled by what I don't know. I'm forever realizing that my understanding, especially in the area of the human brain, is we're in such an amazing time as a psychologist, both with things like the replication crisis, the growth of neuroscience, everything's exploding. And it's very easy to be humbled. So I think that in terms of self-learning, I surround myself with people who are brighter than me. I only feed my brain with quality material. I think that's important. So I'm very selective, not only on what I read as part of my discipline, but even what I expose myself to. There's a lot of stuff that I just do not want want to get in there, whether it be conscious or unconscious. I simply do not want to be wasting my time reading sources or reading material that is just not going to be beneficial. And so just to answer your question, I realize it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but it's recognizing that it's always being open to those new experiences. It's when it's surrounding yourself with the right resources and the right sources.
Okay. So there's a lot of self-belief there about your ability to learn, though, isn't there? I mean, so, the self-belief and, the self-efficacy. So in my model, I think that the concept of belief that I can learn something new and apply something new, it belongs in self-awareness, but it's also a self-learning piece. I think it's a reinforcement. As you learn something, it reinforces, well, if I've learned this, I can learn something else. Do you find that you've got a strong identity or self-belief around your ability to learn?
I think so. I think I've never ever had that question actually asked, and I don't think there. Let me rephrase what I'm about to say. I do have a strong sense that I can learn anything that I put my mind to. That said, there are concepts and ideas that take a long time to digest, and you have to give them time. Mm-hmm. You may not get them straight away. Some writers, their writing is incredibly dense. What they say in a sentence, other people will say in a paragraph, and so it takes you a long time to read a piece like that and understand it. And you have to recognize that it just takes time. So you read it and then you read it again and you read it again. There's nothing inherently impossible about the learning task. Classic examples of this are things like mathematics, where statistical principles will build on other statistical principles, will build on other statistical principles. And I will essentially go right back to the point where the hard ground is that I know, and then build it up slowly. And if I don't understand, if I'm reading a results section and I don't understand a particular technique, I just take it back until I hit solid ground and then build it up. And yeah, that might take me a week, because I might have to go down this channel, ask these people, talk about areas where I don't know, reach out to those people. But I will get there rather than just brushing over it.
Okay. Well, this the fact that you humbled yourself in this, I think it can be intimidating for others who may not have your academic background. But I think the reason the self-learning is in my model is not only that I think there's feedback mechanisms that self-leaders do. They constantly take the self-awareness, the self-regulation, and then if it doesn't work, they take the feedback and make the adjustment. But I think you mentioned we're in really interesting times in terms of neuroscience, and now we have the birth of AI and machine learning. I think if we are not learning, if we're not constantly upgrading our learning, I think the threat is that we're going to be redundant in just a matter of years. And I don't like to be fear-based or fear-monger, but the link of self-learning to success, I think, is a clear correlation. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would add to that. I think it's also the defense mechanisms that people have that stop them learning. So people will protect their ego as opposed to allow their mind to grow. So they'll hold on to ideas because they define themselves by their ideas. Whereas that's just not how I would see it. An idea is an idea, and I enjoy playing with ideas. I enjoy being challenged. I enjoy being wrong, because to be wrong means that there is a gap in my knowledge that I didn't have at time one that's fulfilled at time two. So I have no problem being wrong. Whereas people that want to be right in the absence of data, facts, or logic are going to come a cropper. And exactly as you say, they're going to.
We might have to translate "come a cropper" to our international audience.
They're going to find themselves at a point where reality will come and bite them, and it's.
Sorry to interrupt, Paul. I think you absolutely spoke a nugget of gold there. that this, in this time and place, that people falling in love with their belief or idea, but particularly in the presence of data that disproves that, and have locked their identity with the idea or the belief, will be inflexible and unable to adapt to a changing world. I think you've spoke a real truth there, that some people on their road to success will find difficult to digest, and may prevent them achieving that success.
Yeah, and I think people, just on that point, I think people surround themselves with yes people that are going to agree with them, or they find themselves in echo chambers where they're just hearing their own noise, or they're just reading their own literature that is going to support their view. And that is the wrong way to tackle a hypothesis. You need to look at the counter view, and you need to look at that and say, does that have merit? Where are they coming from? I need to be able to understand them. I need to be able to strong man or strong person that argument.
Yeah.
And then pull it apart, not straw person it. And that's something that I teach my students as well, because I think that it's going to be a vital skill.
Yeah.
For people.
Well, I think, when I grew up, it was reading, writing, and arithmetic. And now, of course, it's communication, collaboration, and critical thinking. And I think this is, and I'm really glad you brought up this idea of defense mechanisms. And we all, as a psychologist, you understand this, but many of the people watching this may not be familiar with the concept of defense mechanisms. How would somebody identify that they're exercising a defense mechanism, and what strategies might they have to overcome that?
That's interesting. Without getting into all the psychoanalytical work involved, to talk it from a lay person's perspective, it's really when I like the idea of character armor, and this idea that you put up a shield, and it protects you from it protects you from things coming in that you're going to find challenging, that you have to work through. So if we just take certain defense mechanisms, so the idea of repression, the idea of having an idea or wanting to do something, or having an idea of who you are, and then just repressing that, not allowing that to surface. You see that a lot with young people who have a certain career aspiration, but their parents have another aspiration, and so they repress that down, and they just pretend that doesn't exist. And eventually that causes a whole lot of dilemmas for them in their life. And that would be a classic example of what we're talking about.
And so this then cycles us back to the self-awareness piece, is the awareness that, hey, I'm not living my own life, right? And the concept of authenticity, as you know, is fraught with problems. Which authentic self are we talking about? Even from a neuroscience perspective, we have multiple senses of self within our brain. We just experience it as a singular panorama. But peeling away, the conditioning of our parents and our society to feel like we are living, our lives rather than somebody else's life. For me, I would identify that as being successful, not necessarily the money or the position or the power, just actually going, I'm living my life. I'm not living somebody else's. For me, that actually is a very simple form of success.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree entirely. And I think the point that you're making about it being a system is really important. We isolate these different components because it's easier to talk about, just like when we talk about the self. We could go down that rabbit hole. But there's no benefit to that necessarily. At the end of the day, we have to live our lives. Yeah. But understanding all of these things interconnect, and they're a system. They are intertwined. And the real benefit comes from having these various areas like self-awareness, like self-regulation, like self-learning, all working together in harmony to ultimately optimize your life. That's the sort of model that I use a lot, especially in coaching, is around what is your optimal self? What does that optimal self look like? Draw it for me, give me that picture, and let's talk about that.
Okay. So coming back to the self-awareness piece, you've done a lot of work in the area of psychometrics and, you know, what the lay people call personality tests, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, in that field, you know, some of it's science and some of it's horoscope, or I've probably offended people with horoscope, but, you know, some of it really has that data background, and some of it's just, you know, just conjecture or extrapolation, right? So if we're looking to increase our self-awareness, get some feedback, what are our personality traits versus putting ourselves in a box, what do we need to look for in terms of being successful in that self-awareness?
Sorry, describe the question again.
I'm sorry, it was a long question, right? So self-awareness is very important, and as part of self, we have personality, right? Our traits. That, you know, you mentioned you're particularly big picture. You're not really a detail person. You mentioned also you're more introvert rather than being extrovert. So within this conversation, you've actually shared some self-awareness around the way your personality operates, your preferences, if I might say, or your traits, right? And, you know, being a psychologist, being data-driven, I know that you have some opinions around some of the psychometric tools out of there that are perhaps not as legitimate as perhaps they pretend to be.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area, psychometrics, because we want to try to measure what it is to be a human and what these things are, like traits, these behavioral preferences that we have. But there are ways of going about this, and the science has moved on a great deal. We now have a strong model of personality traits, which we know as the Big Five. And I think any tool that you're using should come back to some derivative of the Big Five. And the Big Five, many of your viewers will be familiar with it, but for those that aren't, we understand it often, or we remember it by an acronym called openness. Called Ocean.
Ocean.
Yeah. Ocean, with openness being the first. And the key thing to understand with traits is that they are relative measures. So it is where you sit relative to others. Now, this is an important point to understand, because where you will appear on a normative tool, on a tool that's looking at where you sit relative to others, will be dependent on who you're compared to. So you need to understand what was that comparison group. We understand that as a norm group. And a lot of tests don't have norm groups that are culturally appropriate. Tests, there are plenty of tests out there that even create hierarchies inside the traits, which is really not what we're after. We're after where you sit relative to other people, not whether this trait is more than this trait. That doesn't make a lot of sense when we're talking about personality.
So you labeling yourself as an introvert, we'd say I'm more extrovert than you, but I'm more introvert than my wife.
Sure, exactly. And we need to know what that comparison group is. And we need to be able to go down a little deeper. So, you know, if we look at something like extroversion, that's what we would call it the global construct. But underneath that, we have aspects. We have aspects of that really give us the color, the hue on what type of introvert you are or what type of extrovert you are. If we take a trait like conscientiousness, the next one in the Ocean acronym, conscientiousness is made up of two quite different aspects. One is goal-driven, and I'm very goal-driven. The other one is order, structure. That's where I'm very low. So where I score in terms of conscientiousness is more around the middle, but that's not really going to tell you what type or how this conscientiousness is going to play itself out. For that, we need to go down to the aspects. And the model that science has settled on has the Big Five at the top, and then we have these 10 aspects at the bottom. So each one of these global traits is made up of two of these aspects. E is extroversion, A is agreeableness, which I think is a really interesting trait. So people who are highly agreeable tend to avoid conflict. People who are more independent will speak their mind, can be a little bit blunt at times. And then we have neuroticism, which is all to do with how we regulate our own emotions and our emotional states.
Fabulous. All right. So, okay, in terms of, you know, a piece of advice on success, right? You've used your critical thinking in terms of investing, in terms of your academia. All right. In terms of putting this together, how, what do you think would be a nugget of advice if you were saying, look, you want to be successful, what are the things that you need to be aware of?
That's a big question.
I love big questions. You're a big picture thinker, so I thought.
I am. So look, I think if someone said, look, you have to give us one thing to focus on, I'd get people to focus on their behaviors.
Yep.
I would really look to say, well, how are you behaving? Because a lot of people have ideas which are incongruent with their actual behaviors. Look at the behaviors that you are engaged in. Often there's a great saying in martial arts that a black belt is just a white belt that never gave up. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And a lot of successful people that I know have, over a period of time, just one foot after another, but with consistency, have walked a line towards that success. So have a clear picture of what that is. Have a clear picture of what your future selves are. And then step by step, move towards it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I mean, I love the concept of having this best possible future self. We've got this big part of our brain, this prefrontal cortex, which allows us to imagine a best version of ourselves, and then actually engaging in the behaviors to close that gap. And every successful person I've ever interviewed has taken those actions. And as you beautifully revealed, none of them pretend to be perfect. Many of them have made mistakes along the way, but they've adjusted. They've taken that feedback, made the adjustments in their behavior, and continued to move forwards. And I think that's great advice for anybody. It's not rah-rah. It's not, super motivational. But as Zig Ziglar said, motivation is like taking a shower. The effect isn't permanent. You've got to take one each day, right?
Right.
So fantastic. Look, always a great pleasure to talk to you. I'm really impressed that you found the time to share with us. Thank you very, very much for that. And I shall put up some slides which explain Ocean and a link to some of your writings. So for those who are academically minded. So Dr. Paul Englert, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being part of the Self-Leadership Success Summit. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me, and best luck with your work.
Thank you.